Welcome to the IATA at noon with the cargo team. We're going to talk today about COVID-19 and keeping air cargo flying. My name is Brendan Sullivan, for those of you who don't know me. We've got a number of speakers today. So I'm going to host and bounce around to the speakers. First, we'll have Mr. Glyn Hughes, our Global Head of Cargo, followed by David Brennan, our Assistant Director for Cargo Safety and Standards. Then Gordon Wright, our Head of Cargo Border Management. And we're also joined by a special guest, Mr. Stephen Smith, President and CEO of Airlink, to tell us about what Airlink does. So here's just a quick setup for what we're going to do today. Following the Airlink portion of the presentation, we'll open it up to some Q&A. So don't forget to send the Q&A through on the box inside the Teams event. Obviously, as you all know, since this crisis began, all of aviation has been hit, and air cargo has essentially done what air cargo does best, which is being a vital partner in delivering much needed goods across the industry. This has been a very challenging time for our industry. We've had issues on just about all fronts. So we're going to share with you today what some of the IATA actions have been and what some of those issues are, just to give you a sense of where we're at with this industry. So now I'm going to hand over to Mr. Glyn Hughes, and Glyn's going to give us a little snapshot of the state of the industry and some insights on the current economic impact. Over to you, Glyn.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and allow me to say good morning, good afternoon and good evening to all our colleagues out there. And I hope this particular at noon finds you all safe and healthy, and long may that continue. Next slide, please, Brendan. I thought we would start with an excellent quote by our Director General, Alexandre Juniac, and I think he said it so eloquently that this is an unprecedented crisis. But as an industry and as an association and as individuals, we must stay strong and focus on the role that aviation plays in the world, and that we will get through this and the world will be reconnected once again. And this is very important from an air cargo perspective. And as Brendan has said, that air cargo has actually continued to operate, and in fact, it's become even more critical as the crisis has actually commenced. Next slide, please. For those of you that aren't too familiar with the air cargo role in global and international trade, historically, air cargo has transported about 35% of the total value of world trade. Now, this equates to a figure of in excess of $6 trillion worth of goods moving on passenger aircraft and cargo aircraft, i.e. freighters. So during the times of economic growth, air cargo has been fundamental in helping the industry and global manufacturers and consumers receive the products and the goods that they actually need. Now, the second figure there is 1% by volume is very small, and that indicates that the value of air cargo, again, is there moving these high value goods around the world, such as pharmaceuticals, electronic components, automotive spares, aircraft spares, live animals, etc. So it's been a key component of the global industry. Next slide, please. And this particular chart, which all of you will be familiar with, it's from the IATA homepage, and I'm really only going to focus on one item here because the Director General has spoken so eloquently about the loss of industry revenues and the impact. But the figure I'm going to focus on is the middle one, 4.5 million flight cancellations up until just the end of June. The reason why this is so important for air cargo is the fact that about 50% of all the cargo that moves around the world moves in the bellies of passenger aircraft. So when you consider that about 90% of the global passenger fleet is currently grounded, that means you're taking out a huge 45%, in some cases even more, of the potential capacity available for air cargo to use. So the industry has had to be very innovative and creative, because right now air cargo is in huge demand for moving around face masks, all sorts of other PPE. So you've got surgical gowns, outfits, hand sanitizers, ventilators, respirators, all sorts of, plus of course pharmaceuticals and drugs, and ultimately when a vaccine is found, it'll be at the forefront of actually moving the vaccine around the world in a rapid fashion. So with taking that amount of capacity out, it's left huge challenges. Next slide, please, Brendan. And this slide is very important for us as an industry. Air cargo has suffered an awful lot of a number of challenges over the last 2 decades, as has aviation. But for us, the global financial crisis in 2008-2009 reflected a 23% reduction of air cargo volumes over a 12-month period. Now, when you look at the current scenario, those volumes are down only 15%. So again, with all the passenger fleet or most of the passenger fleet grounded, yet volumes are only down 15%, that shows that the demand is huge and the industry has had to respond to that demand in very creative fashions. Next slide, please. So when we look at the overall capacity picture, there's really 2 things that we can extract from this particular chart. And again, I want to thank the economics team for putting some wonderful material together. The blue bars here show how the freighters in operation around the world have actually increased utilization hours, so how many hours they're using them during the day. Perhaps also some parked freighter aircraft, some of the older aircraft have actually been brought back into service. Just because, again, trying to satisfy that demand when you see how much, and this is where the orange line comes into underneath, or the red line, depending on what your screen looks like, which just shows how much total capacity has actually been removed from the marketplace. So even with the increased freighter utilization and some of the more creative scenarios, which my colleagues are going to talk about, which is using passenger aircraft for cargo-only operations, the industry still is short of capacity. And you'll hear from another one of my colleagues about what we've been doing as an organization and with your collective help around the world to make sure that cargo can continue to fly, it can continue to fly safely, and it can continue to fly with the right and required levels of trained staff to support it and regulatory environments to actually enable it. So that's really just a quick introduction from me, Brendan, so I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. And so we're going to move over to Dave Brennan now. I think that really sets the scene for why the industry is doing some of the things that it's doing. And Dave is going to talk to us through some of the actions around safety, around special cargo and more. So Dave, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and hello, everybody. So safety remains the #1 priority for air transport. Brendan, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So, as I said, safety remains the #1 priority. And it's important we don't let that disappear. I mean, it really is critical. And when we look at one of the fundamental planks supporting safety is training. And yet, of course, with the lockdowns, with the social distancing regulations and requirements in place in many, many countries, the ability for people to attend classroom training or for companies such as IATA to deliver classroom training is almost been shut down. And so people are looking at other ways to deliver the required training, and we look at dangerous goods training as one very key element. People are now looking at digital delivery through uses of tools such as Zoom so that they can interact with the students and monitor what the students are doing. But even that's not enough, because some of these digital learning platforms can't just be developed overnight. And so what we've had is many states have issued exemptions providing an extension to the currency for dangerous goods training to get people through the period until we can come back to doing face-to-face dangerous goods training. And this has been promoted by ICAO, and IATA has been working very closely with ICAO, recognising that I talk about dangerous goods training, but there's many other types of recurrent training requirements, flight crew medicals and the like, and this is where states have had to issue exemptions to allow those to continue, otherwise we'd shut the entire industry down. Safety is also important, that we recognise that we have standard operating procedures, work instructions, incident reporting and investigation, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. There's a lot of focus on removing costs. People are not making money, airlines are not generating revenue, so trying to cut costs is normal. But we need to be careful that we can't be tempted into taking shortcuts and trying to do things without following the standard procedures, because the result may be an incident or even worse, an accident, and we do not want that. And that leads me into what we're looking at, and has been touched on by Glyn and by Brendan, is so much of the passenger aircraft fleet is on the ground, and yet there's a huge demand for cargo. And so airlines are looking at utilising these aircraft to move cargo. But these are non-normal operations. This is not the way the aircraft are normally operated. And before airlines get into loading cargo in the cabin, on seats, or as many airlines are looking to do now, remove the seats from the passenger cabin completely and simply use that as a cargo compartment, the airlines really must do a very robust safety risk assessment. They need to identify what can go wrong. And after all, we've got people that are not used to loading cargo in the cabin. We don't have procedures for how the cargo should be restrained in the cabin. What's the proper weight and balance considerations? How do we prevent dangerous goods from getting into the cabin? The aircraft cabin, unlike the cargo compartment, does not have any fire protection, does not have any fire suppression. And so therefore we need to make sure that cargo that could pose a risk, such as dangerous goods, are not loaded into the passenger cabin under any circumstances. And if we look at some of the things that airlines are doing and say they're trying to get their fleet back in the air, we've seen some of this. So here on one side, you'll see the cargo loaded in the passenger cabin. It's very nicely restrained. There's an aisle down the length of the aeroplane. In fact, if it's a twin aisle aeroplane, there's 2 aisles. And there's also space between the cargo so that people can get from one aisle across to the other without having to go the length of the aeroplane. And that's important so that the crew members monitoring the cabin can keep out, watch for smoke, and if there's a fire, to deal with it. And of course, the middle picture, you can see what something like a 777 looks like inside when you pull all the seats out. We need to look at how do we get the cargo into the aeroplane, bearing in mind that it doesn't have a cargo door. So the picture you'll see is using steps, and that's something we don't recommend because of the amount of manual handling that's involved. It's much better to use mechanized equipment that can bring the cargo up to the level of the door, but we need to be careful there to make sure that it's not going to damage the aeroplane because it's not designed to have cargo load in through a passenger door. And we also need to make sure that people aren't put at risk by stepping out onto a platform and potentially falling from the height of the passenger cabin. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see some more examples, including one example that unfortunately was seen, and this is definitely not the way to load cargo into the passenger cabin. And you'll see that the cargo is not restrained. It's moved around. If there was a fire, nobody could get down the length of that aeroplane to get to it, and the airline would be in real difficulty. And that is just what we do not want. We want something more like on the left-hand side, the airline working with their engineering division, flight operations, cabin operations, safety department, ground operations, and of course cargo, to make sure that they've got well-written procedures. They've got people that understand how to do it and can do it properly, and then they follow all those requirements. And then we end up with a safe operation, and one, in fact, that the airline can then use their aircraft to generate revenue. So if we go to the next slide, one of the other issues that came out very early with the outbreak of the coronavirus was the need to move specimens. As the disease evolved in many parts of the world, there's a need to take samples from infected people, send them off to laboratories to identify, do they have indeed the coronavirus or maybe something else? And here air transport is also critical in moving these specimens from the patient or from the doctor's surgery to a laboratory for analysis. And very early on, we reached out to the WHO, the World Health Organization, to have a discussion about what the correct classification for these specimens should be. And we look back at previous experience we had with SARS, with MERS, with swine flu, and we believe that the appropriate classification was that these could be infectious substances in category B, and that goes under UN number 3373. And the importance of this is that these move very, very easily through the transport system. They don't require the full dangerous goods regulations. They can even move through the mail if the postal operators permit it. And so this is a way to very easily get these specimens from anywhere in the world to a reference laboratory. But as we've moved along, of course, the focus is now changing where we have government entities, pharmaceutical companies, research laboratories looking at developing cures, vaccines, treatments for COVID-19. And to do this, they're looking at moving cultures, and cultures of infectious substances is where they've taken the pathogen and concentrated it in a form that now raises the risk level in transport. And here again, we talk to the WHO, and the recommendation there is that these cultures should be shipped as category A, and that makes them fully regulated. They now have to move as UN 2814. They're subject to the full dangerous goods regulations, including an acceptance check by the airline. They go on information of the pilot and command. And probably from a transport perspective, it's because of that they are now in a UN specification packaging. And to give you an indication of how we treat the two, category A, category B, differently, category B, the package has to be able to withstand a 1.2 metre drop test without failure. So whatever's in it has to stay inside the package. Category A requires a 9 metre drop test. So a very, very robust packaging. And for that, we then are very comfortable that these are safe to move in transport. Now, the other side of things, unfortunately, is, as we've seen, there's been very, very many fatalities due to COVID-19. And in some cases, people have died away from home, or their relatives want to repatriate the remains for burial, maybe back where they came from originally, or maybe to where they were born. It's up to the next of kin, of course. And here we've worked very closely, again, with WHO, but also with the US Centers for Disease Control and ICAO to look at, well, what are the risks of moving human remains where the cause of death was COVID-19? Because we want to make sure that not just air transport, but the people who have to prepare the body, the funeral directors, both at origin and destination, and not put at undue risk. And so we've developed some guidance there on the movement of human remains where the cause of death was COVID-19. And we have this and much other guidance material that's now been posted on the IATA website on the cargo page. And if you go there, you'll see that information available. And it's been provided for the benefit of the industry. And we've seen quite a lot of uptake by the industry for this material. So at that point, Brendan, I will say thank you very much to everybody and hand back to you.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, really, really useful information. Just to give everybody a small sense of things, we held a webinar yesterday, and we asked a poll question during that about whether or not they felt all this information that they were getting, if they would benefit from some additional either training, e-learning, etc., or some other form of instruction. And about 90% said yes. That gives you a real sense that these are truly non-normal operations that these airlines are looking to get into and are really looking for our additional instructions. So now I'm going to hand over to Gordon Wright. As I mentioned, he's the head of cargo border management. And Gordon's going to walk us through the ever-changing operational and regulatory landscape that we have during this crisis. So Gordon, over to you. Are you there, Gordon? I think you may be muted.
How are we doing?
Much better. Thank you, Gordon. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. My fault. Yes, so I'll go back to what I was saying. I've been asked to give an operational regulatory update, two key components really on keeping cargo moving in these difficult circumstances that we're facing today. And looking at the first slide that we've got coming up, we've been doing a lot of work like other parts of IATA around industry relief. And the first component I wanted to talk about was slot relaxation, with a shout out to Lara for the update that she gave me this morning as well to help me with this update. So we've been advocating, as many of you will know, with regulators for the suspension of the slot use rules so that the 80% requirement to retain slots is not required this summer. And that's important also for cargo, scheduled services and ad hoc freighter movements. Because both are being disrupted from their normal operations, as you're fully aware. What's helpful is that the return slots from the passenger flights can also be recycled for use by all ad hoc cargo operations. This is a critical component at the moment. And a good example that I looked at this morning, based on some of the information that Lara gave me, is that cargo flights into Heathrow Airport are exceeding passenger flights at the moment. And looking at Heathrow's website, they're actually, the cargo flights are up by 200%. It's really a similar story when we look at the work that we've been doing with advocating with states to reduce landing and parking fees in particular with all the aircraft on the ground. There's been good work being undertaken with IATA actually to reduce some of those fees, and good support coming from regulators. One that the DG spoken to us about on a regular basis during his updates is the financial measurements by governments to support the airline industry. Many of you know that it seems that the national governments are willing to provide support. Clearly, it won't be sufficient to offset all the detrimental impact that will take place, but it is welcome. And I know, and you have heard as well, how much work the DG has done to go with MER and the regions to work with national governments to assist in making sure that money becomes available. One of the things that occurred quite early on in cargo, and I'm sure it's in the same on the passenger side, was the new state transport and cargo restrictions requirements that came in. Some of these were very restrictive. There were quite some invasive health checks being undertaken at the very beginning, which was diminishing opportunities to get flights in and out of affected areas. We've done some good work with ICAO, the European Union, to name just two, in offsetting some of those. What we have seen over the last two and a half months, really, I guess, is new types of goods moving across borders internationally and in volumes that we've never seen before. And one of the ones that I wanted to mention today was medical devices that are moving across borders. And those medical devices are often going through supply chains that are not familiar with them. So the World Customs Organization, which is one of the biggest international organizations that we in cargo work with, have done some really good work around helping to classify those medical devices for customs administrations to diminish any delays at borders and get them to the affected areas. So we've ensured that we've made that information not only available on our cargo C19 page, but available to the industry as a whole. Moving to the next slide, I wanted to say a few things about borders and security. Looking at security first, it's equally important to safety. I think that's fully recognised within IATA. And during these difficult times, it's important that there is no reduction in vigilance as far as security is concerned. And equally, borders. We've got a motto basically in cargo, and that is closed borders, closed trade. And I think that's really an important factor. So a lot of the focus within cargo, and particularly within my team as well, is how can we maintain border efficiencies? How can we maximize it? And one of the ways that we've looked to do that is by tracking country-specific requirements for air cargo. And if you go to our COVID-19 webpage, you'll see that we're tracking about 183 countries at the moment. And contained within that tracking system, you'll see that it contains some CAA regulations, rules regarding the movement of humanitarian goods, aid, medicines, and so on. Equally, I mentioned a moment ago the WCO. On their page, which you can access from our COVID-19 page, you can see that they're doing similar work, but looking at temporary import-export arrangements and so on. So both of them are extremely useful for the industry and for the airlines when they're looking to move their goods around the world. One of our quick reaction communication tools that we used is the cargo border management bulletins. And those have been explicitly focused on COVID-19 measures since the crisis really began. What those bulletins do is that they flag up any temporary arrangements that governments are putting in place for border movements, any new security requirements that are coming along to take into account the crisis. They have emergency contact numbers, and we issue them on an ad hoc basis based on information that we receive. They go out to about 5,000 different individuals and entities, stretching right from international organizations to regulators to cargo supply chain partners and so on. One of the new things that we've started to develop since COVID-19 started was a more engagement with other international organizations, NGOs and associations to look to see how we could collaborate more effectively around trade facilitation repository. And what we actually saw from the early days really was that there was some excellent information held by all these different organizations like UNTAD, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, WEF, and so on. However, that information you had to dig for, you had to go to the website, you needed to know where to look, and basically the information was scattered. That information had some great stuff on best practices and standards, on trade recovery plans, and so on. So we started the development of what we're calling the Trade Facilitation Repository, and that looks to bring all of that information together in one location, which will be hosted by the World Trade Organization, so that if an airline, a regulator, another supply chain partner needed to find a best practice for a COVID-19 related cross-border issue, they could go to this one location and get that information. Similar to what Dave mentioned a while ago, one of the challenges that we've had in cargo is securing appropriate deadline extensions, including security and training certificates. Most of you will be aware when you see all the screeners at the airports in passenger and occasionally in cargo, that many of them are operating off a certification process. They have to go for recurrent training, they have to be rechecked from time to time, background checks and so on. Obviously, that's extremely difficult to undertake systematically at this time during the crisis. So we've worked with many governments, including the US, EU, Singapore, the UK, to come up with temporary arrangements to actually secure an extension deadlines in those particular areas. Moving to the last slide that I've got, it looks particularly at operational efficiencies. Again, one of the early things that we did was recognizing that with many of the airlines actually grounding their fleets, the traditional supply chains were no longer there for goods that were being carried on passenger aircraft and so on. And that meant that often we were seeing some border blockages, particularly when goods were being moved along supply chains where they were not familiar with those goods. So equally to what I said about the medical devices, at our instigation, we asked the World Customs Organization to develop an emergency border contact list for humanitarian goods. And that allows an airline or a supply chain partner that is in a position where they're having their goods blocked to come to the border management team, get the contact name and address and number of the individual who's responsible for that in country, so they can work with them to get their goods released. And we've had a lot of interest from that from airlines and other supply chain partners. We've done also some other work with the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, They've developed some really good recommendations for aircraft operators and staff. It covers everything from social distancing to crew layover. There's some good guidance on the use of PPE, how to deal with passengers who've got COVID, and so on and so forth. So we've done our best to make sure that that's actually circulated within the cargo environment within our usual contact groups. Finally, looking at guidance on health for airport staff in a similar way, we've also been pushing out information that we've received in that domain, but also some best practices that have come through on our air cargo provisions. And we've had some really good cooperation from the World Health Organization, the EU, the US FAA, and that really sets out best practices, sets out some guidance. Again, very, very useful as airlines look to actually put COVID-19 safety and security provisions in to safeguard their staff and also keep cargo moving across borders. With that, Brendan, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Really good snapshot of some of the work that we're doing. I'm now actually going to hand over to Steve Smith, who's the President and CEO of Airlink. Steve, maybe if you could just introduce yourself and Airlink and tell everybody what it is that you all do.
Sure. Thanks so much, Brendan. Good to be here, and thanks so much to Glenn and the team for inviting me. So, yeah, I'm Steve Smith, the President and CEO of Airlink. And many of you may know Airlink, but for those of you that do not, Airlink has been around for, somewhat ironically now, 10 years. This is quite the year to have our 10-year anniversary, I can tell you that. And we're really, in many ways, sort of your program. We're from the aviation sector and non-profit 501c3. And so really the whole sort of genesis behind Airlink is about connecting humanitarian organizations, humanitarian response to airlines and air capacity. And so, again, we've been doing that for a long time. And now, you know, the folks at IATA, you know, have been very supportive of Airlink for many years now. And we've been fortunate to be part of your annual general meetings, even being up on the big stage, your World Cargo Symposium, ATAG event, and your CNS event. And so again, thanks to Glenn and the team for inviting me to talk a little bit about Airlink right now. I thought maybe where I'd start is give a little bit of an overview of the humanitarian sector. I mean, goodness, there's so much information flowing around about COVID-19 on a daily basis. I probably don't need to go too deep into that, but as it pertains to, you know, air cargo and keeping air cargo moving, you know, case count is obviously at an all-time high. You know, the one out in the lead, the US always wants to be the biggest and the best. They're certainly doing that in terms of case count as well right now, which is very unfortunate. You know, from a air cargo, you know, not just the carriers, but we're also heavily engaged with the forwarders as well. And you know, we know that moving cargo right now, or certainly for the humanitarian response, a massive issue is procurement. Okay, all of the procurement, all of the protective gear is coming out of China and some other places, but really mostly China. And you know, there's a lot of what we would deem speculative cargo that people think they have, but they actually don't, or they've been promised it and it's not there, or they've got a purchase order but it's not been produced yet. You know, that against the backdrop of all the geopolitical issues, you've seen all that happening as well. These are all difficult things, not that just the aviation sector and airlines are dealing with, but so is the humanitarian sector. And you know, the traditional NGOs that you might see of, whether it's Oxfam or Save the Children or whoever it might be, you know, they're really having some challenges because they're competing against other governments to buy protective gear, and they're also, you know, like all of us here. I understand this is the first virtual IATA at noon in this sense. You know, they're all sitting at home in their, you know, in their home offices as well, And so, that's a real challenge because, there has not been that much, exchange of staff for a long time in the humanitarian sector, expat exchange, for more than 6 weeks now. But I think that, what we're seeing in terms of, as somewhat a, yes, a facilitator, but almost kind of a quasi customer of air cargo, is that, as you might expect, there's a significant, focus on trade lanes where, and let's face it, a lot of the activity will follow the money, and the most of the revenue right now is in the US. That's where, and also in Europe, that's where all the focus is. And I think that, even speaking with the forwarders, they're experiencing, it's tough. I don't want to use the unprecedented word, because every time you have a conversation about COVID-19, you say, well, it's unprecedented. It sure is. But they're experiencing sort of a Wild West scenario whereby they're selling capacity, and everything's booked up through whatever it is, May at this point. But yet there's so much cargo that's not actually real, because of the issues I talked about procurement a second ago. That capacity is coming available, but then it's being resold over text message and emails within hours, right? And so it's really quite a wild time. And I know we've referenced, that a really cool thing is that the passenger carriers, probably forced out of necessity, but also a desire to help, I think, are getting, I know a desire to help, are getting very creative, putting things into seats and what you will. But I also know, again, speaking with the forwarding teams, is that they also have very limited infrastructure to engage in that dialogue about selling cargo space, and maybe don't have the teams to be able to respond to the request for quotes and what you will. And so, that against, I think, a backdrop of, there's still one thing that is unique about COVID-19 is it's not a humanitarian situation where there's a group of people over there being affected. We're all being affected, and so it's difficult. I think it is difficult to think about another group when you're so personally and your own community is affected. And so I think that there's still some preference for your home base as to where you operate, and we're seeing that. In other areas of kind of the humanitarian sector, the WHO with World Food Program Aviation, Airlink is acting in an advisory capacity on their global airlift program that they are trying to build. But they're struggling to do it. They're struggling to come up with the funding. I think they're trying to have a sort of a hub and spoke system, and they were even contemplating a major, hub and spoke system for in the event that passenger service doesn't return either. And so, we're working with them on that, but that's struggling to get off the ground. There is some days. And I think that, with so many of our partners, airline partners that have parked aircraft, they're looking to try to reactivate. We have a number of partners that, which I think is a unique opportunity for Airlink, because, I think the implied, which I hadn't mentioned before about what we do, is donated, discounted, airlift. It's really the aviation sector coming together to support the response. That may not be a realistic. That may not be realistic in the current times, and so we do have a number of partners that will look to reactivate aircraft for on a cost basis, and that feels like maybe a viable approach. Over the coming months, and this is going to go on for a long time. So, but I think that we one of the biggest challenges, we still don't know what we don't know. We don't know exactly. What you see in the news. Can I get it again? Am I immune once I've first had it? I'm not a medical doctor. I won't go into the details of all those things. And I shouldn't be. But there's still we're still searching for that sort of clarity and end in sight. And I think that's not just the aviation sector, but everyone, even the humanitarian sector. Many of the NGOs I referred to you know, especially the heavy volunteer ones, they're being impacted really hard. I mean, a lot of, or a number of our partners have totally shut down operations because their model is to send volunteers into humanitarian situations and help the people that are affected on the ground. Well, what happens if you can't send your people? Because that's a big challenge. And Airlink doesn't just focus on cargo; we also help facilitate passengers as well. So I think we're still in somewhat of a buying time phase. In game's a vaccine, which isn't developed yet, and so that timing's unknown. But I guess that one thing I would say is that the aviation sector and air cargo is absolutely saving lives, and I want to commend the IATA team for its leadership and guidance on as the industry leader and advocate in the work it's doing, because I think that given these sort of supply and demand sort of imbalance, air cargo is going to remain critical through the end of the year. Let me talk a little bit about what we're doing right now. Right now, Airlink has developed a program called Aviation C.A.R.E.S, and the purpose of this program is really twofold. So on the first side, it's C.A.R.E.S, C.A.R.E.S, coordinated air response for, and it really has three phases. Okay, first it's responding to COVID-19 and identifying credible cargo to move and support the response right now. The thing that is on the horizon, though, I would say in the medium term, but it's not in the medium term. It's happening right now. Is, well, what about all of these more fragile places that that nobody is really focusing on? Because I know that because there's so much focus on the US and Europe, there's not so much cargo, or there's not so much focus down to Latin America. There's not so much focus into Africa. That's only going to exacerbate problems once the case counts, rise, already starting to rise. Maybe we just haven't been measured or tested for yet. That's going to be a massive issue. They don't have the luxury of the same social distancing opportunities that we do. And then I think that the third phase, and so we're focused on building airlift and providing airlift and facilitating airlift right now for COVID-19, ongoing to also these more fragile places. And then the last part is, let's not forget, we've got hurricane season about to start. We've got monsoon season about to start. All these things that we would naturally or we typically respond to in a given year are all about to hit us, and I'm pretty sure they're not going to wait around just because we're all at home in our in our slippers. And so the goal of that program is to raise $10 million in funding and airlift to support the COVID-19 fight. Now, I said they're twofold. The second sort of element of Aviation C.A.R.E.S is, as I said, this is very much the aviation sector's program. It's very much your program. This is the second reason for Aviation C.A.R.E.S is really to celebrate the good things that the aviation sector is doing. I was on a web seminar. Gosh, we're all on those every day, I'm sure. And somebody said it's good to see the carriers stepping up. But I would argue yes, but you know what, they always do, and they have done for a long time. Airlink's been operating for 10 years now, and the carriers in the aviation sector steps up all the time. And so I think it's important. I think it's part of our role to provide a platform to celebrate this. And yes, in the main, Airlink is about donated, discounted capacity for the greater good. But right now, I think it's about getting the job done and helping and supporting the carriers get back on their feet to the extent we can. So I think the thing I would perhaps ask, although I probably could check with your communications folks first, but we have our hashtag Aviation C.A.R.E.S, and so when you see things on the social media postings, reshare them, use that hashtag. It would be a really great thing to have some sort of unifying sort of call. I know we have Air Cargo Strong, and we're all in this together. Those important things. But I think, aviation really does care, and it's I think it's a really great way to sort of celebrating our common bond, because there's certainly enough in the news right now that is flying around, and so I think it's if there's one thing I could ask, it would be great if you could support in that way. Thanks so much, Brendan. I think that's me.
Thank you so much for that, Steve. Really appreciate you walking us through what it is that Airlink does, and in particular the Aviation C.A.R.E.S. So we're actually going to move into a Q&A session now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and pop open the Q&A box. And hopefully you all have had an opportunity to type in some. So I'm going to basically just go through some of the questions. So the first one here is actually for Dave, possibly Gordon. You can supplement as well. Have the periods for the duration of the extension periods for recurrent training been determined?
Well, that's been up to each individual state. Whilst IATA has been promoting the need for flexibility on recurrent training and allowing that to be extended until such time as people can complete proper training, the states have taken their own approach. Some have said, well, yes, but you still have to take certain steps. Some have extended to 30 June, some till November. It's simply in each state's domain to decide how they approach that. And indeed, if they'll even do it, not all states have offered extensions to dangerous goods or other training.
Yes, Brendan, it's the same picture really with security. It's state related. The states are deciding, apart from, but even actually in the European Union, they've basically given the derogation to the states. For some of the derogation, some of it is conditional on desktops being done. So like ACC3 certification, the UK regulator is insisting that there's a desktop submitted for airline stations that are flying cargo into the UK. But for things like security cargo screening, regulators have generally gone for a time period of an extension between 3 to 6 months.
Great, thank you. Sort of semi-technical question here about the aircraft, possibly the belly usage, and is it strong enough to carry some of the large and heavy cargo boxes? They have a different weight, obviously, than passengers, so maybe it's the other way around, in fact. So have the airlines now resolved the difference in weight for cargo with regard to placing things inside the passenger cabin? And what is the guidance here? I don't know, Dave, if you want to start, or I can jump in.
Well, I touched on it a little bit in my presentation, is you have to get these cargo into the cabin. The cabin's not designed to bulk load as a cargo compartment, particularly wide-bodied aircraft, where you can build a pallet or a container in the cargo shed and then move that out to the aeroplane and put it inside the aeroplane using mechanical handling. Loading the cabin is all by hand. And so our recommendations have been that this is part of the safety risk assessment the airline needs to do. If you're going to put it on seats, there's very strict limits on the weight that you can put on an individual seat. And even if you take the seats out, there's still limits on what you could put on the passenger floor in the cabin, or the floor of the passenger cabin, because it's not designed to carry cargo. And so the airlines will be looking at lighter boxes. It's the sort of thing, as people mentioned, masks, gloves, gowns, things like that take up a lot of space, don't weigh very much. They're easy to move and are not going to put stress on the aircraft structure or the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say the passenger cabin floor is significantly different from the cargo belly floor in terms of its capacity. Equally, if loading on the seat capability and where that load now needs to be placed, the downward force and the restrained forces, is significantly different. It can vary by aircraft configuration and seat as well, the actual seat purchased by the airline. So there's a lot of variables, and our guidance material goes into some of that and points them to where the airlines can find more information. So we also have another question for Steve Smith and Airlink. Is there a way to donate money to support Aviation C.A.R.E.S, particularly on an individual level? Is there some way that individuals can do that?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you. That's very kind to ask. airlinkflight.org, airlinkflight.org. And it would be a very easy couple of clicks to do that. That's very kind.
Great, thank you very much. Just scrolling through the questions here. So it starts out, maybe a silly question, but considering the social distancing rule, do you think the design of aircraft could be reviewed to accommodate passengers in the hold with the facilities of a regular cabin, possibly different, and keep some cargo in the cabin? So I'm going to start answering, and then I'm going to hand over to either Glenn or Dave. But actually, this sort of we've had combis in the past. I don't know how many combis still fly around, but there are a few, and there are already a number of states who are looking at this as a potential way to emerge. I don't know about certainly not interspersed in the cabin because you have safety and security and access and all kinds of other considerations, but they're certainly looking at how while the passenger cabin capacity is not necessarily at full, that airlines could find a way to safely include other cargo in it. Glenn, do you want to add something there?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Combi. For those of you out there who are colleagues may not be aware that there were some original aircraft which actually had the cabin split so that the front part was passengers and the rear part was dedicated for cargo. So it was like a freighter at the rear of the aircraft. The economics of those became quite difficult over time, and there were other complaints. I remember a former Director General used to mention that the fish smell from the rear of the cabin was always causing problems for his passengers sitting up front. But I think these are very different times, require very innovative solutions, and we already know that some carriers are looking at configurations that wouldn't be a full combi operation, but as you say, a mixed aircraft type utilization. So you will possibly see some innovations going forward, and it's very difficult to rule everything out. But the key thing, as you mentioned there, Brendan, is safety and security considerations always have to be the foremost at the top of anybody's thinking.
And I might just pick up on that. I think there's some cabin crew would very happily have passengers sit down in the cargo hold because they're a pest and they could get them away from them. But unfortunately, the design of the aeroplane doesn't allow that, and there's no life support down there for passengers, much as we might like to put some of them there.
Spoken like a true cargo professional. Thanks, Steve. Question here around whether cargo operators are facing issues with airport operators. There was some discussion around the charges issue, but do we see any other areas? Glenn, I know you've been exploring some of the landside issues, some of which obviously relate to the airport operator. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, and again, it's one of those things that people didn't foresee what the potential implications could be to switch off basically the passenger interconnected networks. Flight diversions, route diversions, there needs to be airports that are sometimes kept open purely for potential for flight diversions. So the SFO guys and the regional teams have been, excellent in trying to make sure that there is an adequate safety net, as it were, for potential flight diversions. We have seen in a number of countries, as you quite rightly mentioned, difficulties of getting staff to and from airports when there are curfews in place. And in India, there was an immediate need because, of course, the government implemented a curfew before they could implement a solution as to how to determine frontline staff, as it were, critically defined staff could get access to and from work, which meant that cargo very quickly was backlogged at the airport. And when you consider, when it comes to things like fighting the COVID-19, paracetamol or paracetamol-based drugs are the #1 treatment, home treatment, as it were, to bring a fever under control. And 85% of the global manufacture of paracetamol is in China and India, and the demand was just going through the roof, and yet there were blockages. So there was, this is actually really what prompted a lot of the airlines to put on as many charters as they could. But then we found that cargo was actually being backlogged at the airport, people being asked to actually remove their cargo immediately, which then brings in the point Gordon was mentioning about the clearance processes. So there was a whole series of toppling effects, which is why ICAO, interestingly, which is a regulator at international air, civil aviation, is actually now looking at has convened a working group to look at land and land-based situations. We need truck networks to be able to get into and out of airports. So there's a lot of consequential issues that the industry has needed to tackle.
Yeah, absolutely. Sticking with the operational for another minute, is there a high-level process for establishing guidance material? So is it IATA SMEs, or does it involve industry SMEs as well? And if so, how is alignment achieved? I'll start just by saying I think it really depends on what type of guidance material we're actually talking about. Gordon mentioned some, which would be highly intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. I think Dave's got some that he mentioned that were a mixture of the two. So maybe Gordon and then Dave, if you want to just talk through the high-level process to get to an aligned position for releasing some of these guidance materials.
Yeah, I mean, if it comes to borders, looking at the customs requirements and the trade requirements, most of the alignment work is done working with such organisations as the WTO and the WCO. So the IATA SMEs not only attend the meetings, but they often actually draft and develop the guidelines, standards and requirements with these organisations that are then distributed with the industry. On the security, it's quite a similar situation. With ICAO, we're involved in the working group on air cargo security, on other groups, to again help develop some guidelines. We did some recent work around explosive dog detection work with ICAO. That's how we do it. But they're all different parts of the same jigsaw. And I think that's probably where this question was. And that's why we developed the repository that we're looking at a moment that looks to bring this all together. You won't have any one organisation that is looking to cover off every single aspect, certainly of border management. It'll be a patchwork, but at least if you could go to one location to get the information, that would be helpful. And that will be our repository.
Dave, did you want to add something for some of the other operational guidance that we've been working on?
Yeah, so I think if we look at the loading of cargo in the cabin on passenger configured aircraft, that's been a mix of IATA SMEs, so people from safety, flight operations, cabin operations, ground ops, cargo, of course. We've also been working closely with FAA, EASA, Boeing, Airbus, and we've also reached out to some of our airline members to get their feedback on their experience, and then to put that back, particularly when we did the second edition of the guidance, and now we're working on the third edition. So the first edition was very much, if you like, internal, with some work taken from the major regulators, but then beyond that we've expanded to bring in, if you like, information from outside. On the movement of infectious substances, cultures, it's been ICAO, WHO, CDC, and ourselves.
Yeah, so it changes a little bit depending on what type of guidance we're trying to release and to whom, I guess, we have as a target audience.
Correct.
So we're getting close to the end of time. I've got one more question here for Steve Smith. Could you explain some of the reasons why governments and international NGOs are competing rather than collaborating in this situation? So the question goes on to say, I understand the part about competition for medical supplies, because that's more people now need them. But is that the case in other scenarios as well, where they quote unquote compete with each other?
Yeah, I'm off you. No, thank you for the question. I think this is a really unique situation. Again, because COVID-19 is not just affecting, as I said, a group of people over there. It's affecting, yes, it is affecting them, but it's also affecting us where we at our core. And so, and everybody is trying to do this, unfortunately, in somewhat of a disorganized fashion. I think that there is, gosh, this is much the topic of a much longer question and answer, I think. But yes, the humanitarian sector is very fragmented at the best of times. And so, there's always, the irony is that all these organizations go in to help them. It's all great. The world's a better place to have them. But you're right. You're darn right that they compete for resources. And so, but I think that this is a fairly unique situation whereby you've also got governments that are needing to step up to prop up their own health systems with protective gear that nobody was planning on, nobody was ready for. And so that's what's causing a funny dynamic. So in some ways, many of the traditional NGOs that might be responding are quite incapacitated right now, because there's no way you can compete against international governments chartering aircraft, buying all of the supplies at this point. And so I think that's probably the answer.
Great, thank you for that. So we're going to wrap up in a minute or two. I know we have a few more questions, and maybe we can get back to people individually. We'll capture those and maybe put out a little. We're actually doing a similar thing with the questions we got on the webinar, putting out an FAQ. So we'll update everyone. So before I start the closing it, I want to share a video. So this is a video from one of our cargo colleagues, one of our many multi-talented cargo colleagues. And just to put things in context, what you're about to see is from someone who's had a career in customs and border protection, normally wears a suit to work every day. And so perhaps you'll see a small shift in dynamic in what in our colleague. So here you go. Here's a little video for you.
We are facing an unprecedented crisis. And as the virus has expanded, outside the borders of Asia and everywhere in the world, we have seen very quick and severe measures of restricting flights, banning flights, closing borders, and so the traffic has dropped.
Air cargo strong, we gotta keep moving. The world needs us to continue improving, delivering medicine more important than it's ever been. Medical equipment and goods, humanitarian. While the industry's been pounded with flights being grounded, air cargo counted, it is helping to rebound it. Passenger planes being used for all cargo. Anything, everything carried to start flow. COVID-19 is the worst that we've seen, but we're stronger than that. Even when lean, believe we'll be back and stronger than ever. When the virus is behind us, we'll only get better. Together we stand, united in war. Socially distanced, but closer for sure. So keep your heads up, IATA is here. Working from home, but our mission is clear. Air cargo strong, keep it moving. Air cargo strong, keep it moving. Air cargo strong, keep it moving. Keep it moving. Air cargo strong, 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 strong.
So there you have it.
Very cool.
Possibly one of my coolest colleagues ever. No offense to the other gentleman on the screen, but that's Sean Beddoes, also known as Bruce Willis, with Air Cargo Strong. Great video. It kind of captures our sentiment. So thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you to all of the colleagues, everyone here at IATA virtually who's joined us. And in particular, thank you to AirLink. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. not just for speaking, but also just for the work that Airlink does. So thank you very much, and look forward to speaking with and seeing you all in the near future.